Folks, I was thinking it was a long, long time ago. In fact, I was 9 years of age, and I was growing weary of my two older brothers and their constant teasing and harassing and sometimes physically beating up on me, the little brother. I want to talk particularly to the children who are in worship with us today, but also you grown-ups. If you're a younger sibling, you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you got teased, sometimes you got picked on, sometimes you got harassed a little bit. My brothers used to play tag team wrestling. They had each other, and they'd say, "Mark, you can have the dog." We had a poodle. Not much help. This one particular day, I remember snapping. My brother and I were in the living room, and we were arguing. My father stormed into the room, filled with rage. "What are you boys arguing about?" He could hear the barking and bickering throughout the house. And his way of resolving the conflict was to split us up. My oldest brother, Stephen, got chewed out. Stephen's 4 years older than me, a lot bigger than me at that point. Dad was kind of giving him the gears. "Listen, son, you cannot be picking on your little brother. You're too big now." But you know what? That didn't matter to me. I was more angry because I got sent to my room. See, my brother Stephen, he just got chewed out in the living room. I got sent away. I got sent down the hallway and into my bedroom. And while I sat there in my bedroom, stewing on my bed, I could feel the anger beginning to boil. I began to erupt and flare up with rage at oh my goodness, the injustice. Steve's out there in the living room, and I'm stuck here in my bedroom, and that's when it happened. I literally snapped. I came up with a kid brother plan. I snuck out of my bedroom, went out the back door of the house, and I circumnavigated the house. I came in the front door by the living room at full steam. I came tearing across the living room floor, and I launched myself into midair so that as my brother is talking with my father, I connected with him. I sucker punched him right in the nose. And for one very brief moment, oh, the satisfaction. I could feel my brother's nose crunch under my pudgy little 9-year-old hand. I could feel his glasses being knocked off his face. They went scattering across the floor. Oh, the satisfaction indeed. For one very, very brief moment. In fact, that moment was so brief that it ended before my feet hit the ground. I landed on my feet, and I knew what I'd done. I knew how my anger had got me into trouble, and so I just kept on running down the hallway, straight into the only room in our house that had a lock on the door, and I locked myself into the one and only bathroom in the house. You've been there. I waited and waited. It didn't matter that the rest of the family was pounding on the door saying, "Mark, let us in. We got to use the bathroom." "No, Steve's going to kill me." I waited for most of the rest of the day, hoping my brother would cool off a little bit because I knew what was coming. Folks, I've been thinking about Jesus and his teaching about forgiveness. And there is so much to be said about Jesus' understanding and his intentions for us regarding forgiveness. There's no possible way we could cover it all in one morning. Books have been written on Jesus' understanding of forgiveness. Study groups, prayer groups have gathered around his teachings on forgiveness. Preachers have preached summer-long series on the power of forgiveness. Well, today I want to say then simply this, that if we could reduce Jesus' huge understanding of forgiveness to this one moment now, it would be this. Jesus' teaching about forgiveness is about our reconciliation with God, and it's about our reconciliation with one another. Jesus called us to forgive one another because the only way we can find healing for ourselves, for our churches, our communities, our cities, our nations, is by extending forgiveness to one another. Jesus knew If there was going to be healing on this planet, if there was going to be healing for my heart and yours, if there was going to be reconciliation for us with each other and with God, the only avenue to access that would be through this gift of forgiveness. Now, Jesus knew a thing or two about forgiveness, didn't he? Jesus said to Peter when he asked, look, if somebody wrongs me, how often do I forgive them? 7 times? Peter thought he was doing a big thing. 7. It's lucky 7. 7's a big number. Somebody messes you once. Hey, once bit, twice shy, right? So Peter thinks he's bringing a big number to Jesus. Should I forgive him 7 times, Lord? Look at me. I'm willing to forgive 7 times. Jesus says, no, Peter, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, that number 77's been with me for a long time, and it's easy for me to remember because it was Phil Esposito's number when he retired from the National Hockey League. But I remember 77, and every time I see Phil Esposito skating and I saw 77, I remember Jesus teaching, oh, right, I'm supposed to forgive 77 times. I'm to forgive my brother 77 times. I'm to forgive my teacher 77 times. I'm to forgive my preacher 77 times. I'm to forgive everybody who wrongs me 77 times. Phil Esposito got a Stanley Cup. All I got is God's grace. Actually, some people translate Matthew's gospel and they say, no, Jesus didn't say 77 times we're supposed to forgive those who wrong us. It's 70 times 7 times. 490 times. It's huge. It's huge. I have a hard time forgiving once. Peter thought he was bragging with 7. Jesus says, no, 77 times or 70 times 7. Like I said, Jesus knew a thing or two about forgiveness. He died so we could be forgiven. He gave it all so that we could be reconciled with God and so that we would have a model of what forgiveness is, how to lay our lives down, lay our egos down, lay our pride down, lay our agenda down, that we might be reconciled with one another. Jesus knew, didn't he? I think Jesus also knew that if we refuse to live in the grace of God and therefore have the inability to forgive, if we are stubborn in our pride, if we are stubborn in our anger, if we are stubborn in our fear, if we are stubborn in our sense of injustice, if we are stubborn in our need for revenge, then our hearts grow hard. Jesus knew our hearts would become like rock. Jesus knew that a dark spirit could wrap itself around our hearts and we'd start behaving in ways that were not ways that God had intended for us. We'd be like people being led around by a big, burly dog dragging them on a leash. Only it'd be our anger dragging us, or it'd be our pride dragging us. I remember not too many years ago when my children were much younger. My wife and I had taken them away for spring break. We decided we'd come home one day early. Well, we surprised the people who were in the midst of robbing our house when we pulled into the driveway. They were still there. Actually, we pulled into the driveway and I saw the speakers from my stereo system in our driveway. And I'll tell you, it's one of those surreal moments where what on earth are those speakers doing there? And this is back in the 90s, back when speakers just weren't good unless they were huge. All I could think of is, well, maybe my brother, Steve, you know Steve. Steve, who was checking on our house every couple of days or so, maybe he'd had a party. And somehow things got out of control and the speakers ended up in the driveway. You got to know Steve. Little did I know that grown-ups were circumnavigating the neighborhood in a pickup truck, and they'd sent young teens into our house to rob us. And they'd throw things into the driveway, and the pickup truck come around. Those teens, they'd scurry down the driveway and throw it in the truck, and the grown-ups keep going around. So that way, if the police show up, it's the kids who get busted, not the grown-ups. Well, we walked in on this, and I'll tell you, terribly upsetting. Thank you thankful for the grace of God, I realized they're still in the house, and the only way for them to get out is through the door that I'm standing in front of, and I didn't feel like getting shot or getting that kind of trouble. So I ran next door, had the neighbors call the police. By the time I'd come back, those burglars had gone out of our house through the back door, taken off over the fence. Well, for the next couple of weeks, I had a hard time sleeping. Oh, the first night or two, of course, we all slept together, huddled together, cuddled together down in the rec room, and that's what you need to do if somebody's violated your space, violated your being, your family. But still, after a week or two went on, after the window upstairs had been repaired where the burglars had broken in, after the fingerprint dust had all been cleaned up and everything was slowly starting to come back into order, I was still having a hard time sleeping. I remember one night, my wife Beth said to me, "You're still awake, are you?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Are you afraid the burglars might come back?" I said, "No. Actually, I'm hoping they will come back." There was a very dark spirit wrapped around my heart. I wanted confrontation. I wanted to meet these SOBs face to face. I wanted them, if you are man enough to break in my house, then be man enough to look me in the face. I started living out of my anger. The police said that the neighbors had reported seeing a pickup truck, a red pickup truck, circumnavigating the neighborhood at the time our house was being robbed. I remember coming home at lunch one day, and there was a red pickup truck driving down our street, a through street. It's easy enough for a pickup truck to be going up and down it, but through the lens of my anger, through the lens of my need for confrontation, to avenge what had happened to my family, I started following that red pickup truck. I followed it down Dufferin Street. That's our street. It turned left onto English. I turned left onto English. It turned right onto Queens Avenue. I turned right onto Queens Avenue. I followed that red pickup truck for 15 or 20 minutes. I followed that red pickup truck from the east side where we live straight through downtown onto the west side. Not even thinking about it. And if you're from Cleveland, you know there's a dark spirit around you if you're following east side to west side and you don't even think about it. Finally, when I'd driven 15 or 20 minutes, thankfully the grace of God was upon me. And I thought, what am I doing? What am I doing? I'm being dragged around by my anger. I'm being dragged around by my need for vengeance. I'm being dragged around by my need for confrontation, to set things right. Vengeance is mine, says God. And I said, well, that's fine for you, Lord, but me and this red pickup, we got business. But it was at that moment that I began to do that hard, faithful work of forgiveness. It was at that moment when the process could begin. And I said a little prayer, Lord, help me forgive my enemies. They do not have a face. They do not have a name, not to me, but they are known to you. And so am I, Lord. I need your help to help me forgive them. Not because they needed to be let off the hook, and not because what they did was right. I'm not condoning that, but I needed to be set free. I needed to be a new being again. And instead of letting the anger define me, I needed the grace of God to define me. That's the problem when you can't forgive. When you can't release that negative power that the wrongdoer or that terrible experience has upon you. If you can't let it go, you start to forget who you are. You look in the mirror in the morning and you don't recognize the face looking back. You start living out of your anger instead of your joy. You start living out of a need for vengeance rather than out of the grace of God. Each and every one of us in this room here today, we have been created in the image of God. What do you think happens to that image of God within us when we let our anger become our master? When we let our fear or our need to be right become our master? We forget who we are. Jesus said you can't have two masters. You're going to love one and hate the other. And guess what? My master was a red pickup truck. I'd forgotten who I was so badly, I started chasing phantoms around. I didn't just chase that red pickup truck, every pickup truck I saw within a 200-mile radius. I needed to remember who was master and therefore remember who I was. Isn't that the task that Jesus calls us all to? To forgive our enemies, to forgive the wrongdoers, to forgive that terrible, terrible experience, whatever it is in your life, so that you can be free once again, so that that dark spirit wrapped around your heart can be broken, and the Spirit and love of God in Jesus Christ could be set loose once again. You can remember who you are, a child of God, made good, made beautiful, and restored in Jesus Christ. Do you know, 10 years ago today, we all got sucker punched in the nose by a group of Al-Qaeda terrorists. And for a very brief moment, there was a great sense of coming together among us. We really were shoulder to shoulder for some time. I remember driving through Atlanta about a week or two after 9/11, 2001. Somebody actually let me merge onto I-75. I thought, my goodness, we are being much kinder, much more humane with one another. Perhaps the people God made us to be. Do you remember, I think it was the night of September 11th, 2001, our House of Representatives, the Congress, right, left, Republican, Democrat, I believe there was one independent, and they all stood on the steps of the Capitol building, and they sang, "God bless America, God bless America." We were shoulder to shoulder for one brief moment. But then something happened. I don't know what it was. Something happened. And for the last 10 years, I think as a people, we've been getting harder and harder with one another. We've engaged in these shout fests with each other. We've been tearing each other down as if we are the enemy of each other. It doesn't make sense to me. Do you know, this past Friday, we had former state senator Brooks Douglas here at the Old Stone Church for a prayer service. And if there's anyone who would have even the slightest right for hanging on to his anger, if there's anyone who would have a challenge offering or extending forgiveness, it would be Brooks Douglas. If you don't know his story, Brooks Douglas, when he was 14 years of age, had his home invaded. His mother and his father, leaders in the community, a Baptist pastor and his wife, Brooks's mother, and his 12-year-old sister was there that day too. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen preparing dinner, getting ready for the family meal. And there was a knock at the door of their little country home. And two men stood at the door, said, "We have car troubles. Can you let us in, please, to use your phone?" Of course, they're good, hospitable Christian people. "Please come in and use our phone." Well, in an instant, things went from good to horrific. In an instant, his life changed forever. They tied up his parents. They tied him up. They did unspeakable things to his 12-year-old sister repeatedly. And then they sat down at the family dinner table so that they could enjoy the dinner that Brooks's parents had been making that evening. And then these two thugs, whooped up on drugs, hungry for cash, shot and killed his parents in front of him. Then they shot Brooks. They shot his sister. Thankfully, I guess, by the grace of God, Brooks lived, and so did his sister. After the men left, his sister was able to free herself, and she untied Brooks, and at 14 and 12, they got in the family car and they drove down the road looking for help. For the rest of their young years, they spent time in and out of court testifying against these men who were eventually caught. In and out of court, dealing with legal issues, legal battles. And as you can imagine, a person who experiences that during their formative years, he became a lawyer. And then he ended up being a politician and eventually state senator in the state of Oklahoma. One day as state senator, he was touring one of Oklahoma's prisons. And he learned that one of the men who had murdered his parents, had done unspeakable things to his sister, was there, being held in that prison. And he asked if he could see that man. Could I please speak with that man? And he had an opportunity to sit down for an hour and a half and have confrontation. He had the ability to meet that wrongdoer face to face. And he said clearly to the man, I am not here to forgive you. That's my parents' doing. That's not my doing. I just need confrontation. I knew about that. But he said he found himself struggling to be mad at the man, struggling to be angry. The way former Senator Douglas described it, he said it was as if the Spirit of God was surrounding him like jello. Every time he tried to be angry, he couldn't. He said the man told Brooks Douglas that he just got his GED the week before. Brooks didn't want to care, but he did. There was a humanity being restored in him, and he said, good for you, that's really good. The man said that he'd been saved in prison during his time, and Brooks wanted not to care, but he did. His humanity was being restored, and he said, praise God. And he still refused to forgive him, and he said after an hour and a half, he got up and he left the table where they were visiting. He walked to the door, he put his hand on the door handle, and he heard a voice from God saying, Brooks, you're not done here yet. You are not done what I've sent you here to do. So Senator Douglas turned around and he said, I forgive you. I forgive you. And he said, in the exact moment that he forgave that man, all the anger, all the rage, all the violent inclinations that were welling up in him, he said, poured out. It was like he had holes in the bottom of his feet, and they poured out like water. And he found himself being refilled with this incredible spirit of love, of joy, of mercy, of grace. He remembered who he was. He was a child of God. And his freedom and his peace was being restored in forgiveness. Later on, Friday morning, Brooks Douglas said that when he ran for state senator, it was in a day and age where you had to be genuine with people. You had to be careful and kind and humane with one another. He said, I got elected by going door to door, knocking on people's doors and telling them who I was. And he said they voted for him not because of him, but because of who his parents were. They said, oh, we remember your parents, Brooks. We'll vote for you. He said, but in this day and age, people seem to get elected not through a gentle spirit of humanity, but they get elected by shouting at each other. They get elected by creating these kind of false arguments and demonizing one another. There's no way our Congress in this day and age would stand shoulder to shoulder and sing God Bless America. They think each other's the enemy. It seems to me here, this 10th anniversary of September 11, 2001, that we might reclaim this time as a time of reconciliation for our nation. That we might remember who we are as one nation under God, one people being restored and living out Christ's mission of reconciliation in the world. We might right here and right now make a pledge that we will not demonize our own brothers and sisters, whether they be politicians, members in the church, or members in our family. I love my brother Stephen. Yeah, he picked on me a bit. Yeah, I sucker punched him once. But the truth is, he's my brother. He's my brother. And it's only through forgiveness that we can always be brothers, that we can be reconciled with one another. Maybe this is the day and age where we forgive those Al-Qaeda terrorists. Oh, now you're squirming in your seats. But that's what Christ asked us to do. Not to condone it, my goodness, absolutely not. Not to accept it, no way. But to forgive it. To forgive it if for no other reason that the stone on our hearts could be cracked open and the grace of God might thrive within us as a people once again. Maybe we need to forgive those Al-Qaeda terrorists just as we need to forgive one another and what's been done to us and what we've done to others over the last 10 years. Jesus said, what God has brought together, let no one put asunder. Works well in a wedding service. But let me tell you, it also applies to a nation. God has brought us together as God's people. And if we refuse to live our lives in the grace of God, we are always going to be divided. Let me tell you, if our liberty is at stake today, it's only because of our own refusal to live in the reconciling power of God's mercy and forgiveness and extend it to one another. But if we are going to be one people, one nation under God, indivisible, then we will do it by extending forgiveness, by living in that forgiveness. 10 years ago, Al-Qaeda terrorists sucker punched us. They sucker punched us. Today, we have the power to forgive that and to move forward and to live in the grace and mercy of God. Amen.